Hello and welcome to Newsnight, where we talk to some of the major players in Nigeria's journey to growth and development. I am Ladi Akeredoluale. Thanks for being with us. My guest today thinks President Muhammadu Buhari was correct to raise alarm about the appearance of challenges to democracy, particularly those of respect for term limits in West Africa. My guest also thinks after the mistakes made in the first three national elections following Nigeria's return to democracy in 1999, the next three elections have witnessed substantial progress in entrenching credible and fair outcomes. Newsnight talks to a senior fellow at the Center for Democracy and Development and former chairman of the West African Civil Society Forum, Professor Ibrahim. Prof, thank you for your time. Welcome to the program.
It's a pleasure.
In his speech to the UN General Assembly, President Buhari talked about, among other things, he mentioned the fact that it seems as if democracy is having some challenges, particularly on the continent and in West Africa. If we bring it to West Africa, we've had coups in Mali and in Guinea. But thankfully here at home, that hasn't happened in Nigeria. But I'm taking that as the backdrop to ask you, what's the status report for our own democratic process? We've had it now since 1999, longest ever since our independence. What do you make of it down the line?
I think clearly that Nigeria has made considerable democratic progress. The First Republic lasted 5 years. The Second Republic lasted 4 years. The Third Republic didn't take off, and the Fourth Republic is in its 21st year. So I think we have found a way of sustaining our democratic model in spite of the challenges that have been occurring. So that's on the positive. On the negative, it's clear that Nigerian democracy has a lot of problems. One of the core problems is that we have political democracy without political dividends for the people. People expect that democracy is a better system of governance and therefore should produce tangible or concrete results for them. And people are saying they are not seeing an improvement in their lives and their livelihoods. That's one challenge. The second challenge may be even more serious, which is how committed are the key political actors, in particular the political parties, to the model of democracy. Consistently, we have seen political parties have rejected practices of internal party democracy. They are controlled by factions and godfathers, and party members never have a say in party affairs. This suggests that there is a deep weakness in our democracy because the key actors do not appear to be fully convinced about its practices and its culture. And I think there's a sense in which that's really our greatest challenge. How do we open up the democratic system and get the political actors to engage in democratic practices at all levels? On the whole, I'm confident that we'll continue to improve our democratic model. And the reason for my confidence is that the quality of our elections have been improving over the years. You remember, after the first election of the Fourth Republic, the second in 2003, and the third in 2007 were a charade of elections. Votes were not counted or were not conducted. Results were announced for ruling party candidates who did not contest or who changed the results in the collation process. Over the past 3 general elections there has been a steady improvement in the quality of our elections. This means, as we move forward, those parties that are not democratic in their practices will begin to suffer major setback, and other parties will be encouraged to take democratic practices more seriously.
The issue you've mentioned and which you touched on, the electoral process, is not the only thing in democracy, but it is one of the major things because that is the process by which the leadership emerges. We have had problems with that in Nigeria from 1960, even before 1960, and it has been the source of a great deal of instability for the country. But as you pointed out, it appears as if there has been some steady improvement in the last decade or thereabouts. But there are people who still say there's still a long way to go, and that they see that ever since 1999, we've been tinkering and amending and adjusting the Electoral Act and other provisions of the Constitution as they relate to our elections. This is what provides the framework for whatever INEC, which is the election management body, uses. Do you think that this very last adjustment, the one that took place this year, coming from all the previous ones that we've had, do you think it added something positive, considering all the acrimony that it generated?
Well, the amendment hasn't occurred yet. As you are aware, both the Senate and the House of Representatives have passed it, but there are differences in terms of what they've passed. So they've just set up a joint committee to resolve the differences.
Right.
My sense is that these improvements in the Electoral Act and the Constitution are incremental gains because what they have done is to identify loopholes that have emerged because of the ingenuity of our politicians. You do a law and you block certain practices, and they find a way around it. Then you have to now tinker again with the law to block the new way around they have found. And there's a sense in which you cannot continue to do that forever. Democracy can never be practiced fully simply on the basis of everything being in the law. Democracy is also a culture. It is a practice. It is a way of life. And what I find in this country is that the Nigerian people are profoundly democratic. They want the opportunity to elect their leaders. They want their choice to count. Often, they do not succeed in getting their choices to count. And therefore, while we have a political class that's fundamentally anti-democratic, the people themselves are profoundly pro-democratic. And I think my hope and my aspiration is that the vision of the people will triumph at the end.
In Africa, Nigeria appears to be unique. Almost 500 ethnic groups, different kingdoms, different attitudes, different cultural backgrounds. And I am taking note of the fact that you said that while the people appear to be democratic, the leaders that have emerged and those practicing democracy at that level appear not to be. Against that background, do you think that one of our fundamental problems is this complexity that we have? So many ethnic groups, large country, huge population. So to get those kinds of practices into our leaders might be our challenge. And after all, 60 years, when you talk about a country, may not be such a long time, is it? What do you make of that?
Well, I agree that our country is complex, it's large, it's diverse. But think about it. India is larger, is more diverse, is more complex, and they've been able to sustain the democratic models. although like us, they do have certain challenges, once again linked to full acceptance of the democratic culture by its leadership. My position has always been complexity and diversity are supposed to be positive elements for democracy. Because what's the bottom line for democracy? It's tolerance, it's accepting the other, it's civility towards all. And if you can do that in a heterogeneous and complex society, then the quality of your political system is very, very high. And let's not forget, maybe the most monolithic country in the world has been Somalia. And that is the country that has been the most torn apart in terms of its politics and society. Every Somali descends from the same great-grandfather. And today, they are, not just today, for the past 50 years, they've been killing each other. So I never make a fetish of diversity or being a homogeneous society.
That brings me then to the other issue of people participation. You touched on it when you say, well, the people are democratic, those doing the practicing and those they are looking to may not be quite so. And it seems then that a disconnect has now been brought in. The people hear about elections, they get mobilized, and people say, come vote for me, and so on. But as elections have progressed, we've seen more and more people, it appears, turn away from the process and say, it doesn't matter. I mean, what we think wouldn't count at the end, or we couldn't really be bothered. How does their election affect my lifestyle? Are we not building a problem in that assessment, because now there seems to be this gap between the leaders and the led?
You know, my greatest fear about Nigerian democracy is the way in which the political class is trying to drag the ordinary people into its practice of corruption. In previous elections, politicians will bribe security, they will bribe their party bosses, they will bribe the media, they will bribe people who can influence outcomes of election, usually in illegal matters. But as the quality and integrity of the election started to improve, the politicians started bribing the voters themselves directly. And clearly, the objective is to corrupt them. And this, for me, is one of my greatest fears for Nigerian democracy. If a majority of voters expect to be given monetary rewards to vote in a certain way, it means they have no say in the practice of governance that will emerge because they have been, as it were, bought. I think this is a problem that all of us with a commitment to democracy must address. And the way to address it is through political education. People have to understand that they cannot afford to sell their votes. And if they do sell their votes, they are compromising their capacity to exercise choice in a political system, when often Nigerians are very opinionated in their sense of who should have power and who should not. And that power to determine who should exercise power on their behalf is extremely important. We must urge them not to lose that power.
But there is the problem then, I don't know, I guess I've spoken to a few people who have said this, a case of the chicken and the egg, which comes first. If we say that people shouldn't sell their votes because that will compromise their ability to make a choice, probably also compromise their ability to hold such leaders accountable, the other side of it is, what makes them susceptible to such blandishments? poverty. So, but if you don't get the right type of leaders, you can't tackle poverty. But poverty is what leads them to also take money from people who obviously are not suited or suitable for the job. So that's why I said it's a question of the chicken and the egg.
Yes, poverty is prevalent in our society. We have a very large proportion of poor in Nigeria. But don't forget, what they get paid is not something that can address their situation of poverty. We know what the numbers are. They are bribed between 1,000 and 3,000 naira for their votes. That's an amount of money that's so small they are likely to spend it that same day. So they need to understand, and that's why I talk of political education, that that money they receive is so small and it's really of no value relative to the power of their votes, and that they can afford to give up on that so that their vote could have more power, and they can look for leaders they put in place who can actually address their fundamental problem of poverty.
Is there a link, do you think, between that political education that you've just talked about and political history, from the context of we have always had the battle that when we have so many political parties, the system is unstable. And when they point out to other democracies that we are probably expected to emulate, most of them have, in actual fact, a two-party system. Talk of the UK, talk of the US, talk of India that you mentioned, and that in our own case, part of our problem, foundational problem, is this multiplicity of parties that at the end of the day have very little input into the process anyway.
You know, impressions can be very deceitful. No democratic country in the world has a two-party system. The US doesn't have a two-party system. UK doesn't have a two-party system. India doesn't have a two-party system. These countries actually have dozens, sometimes hundreds of parties. In India, for example, they have 3 categories of parties: national parties, regional parties, and local parties. So you have in India parties that only contest for local government elections. What you are talking about is that in many democratic systems, 2 parties tend to be dominant, especially when you have the first past the post electoral system. When you have proportional representation, as you have on the continental Europe, then you tend to have 5 or 6 dominant parties, because proportionality tends to
diffuse the concentration of the votes.
Yeah. So our issue is we have a first past the post system, and it is therefore normal in such a system that 2 parties would be dominant. The issue really is, do the 2 parties need to remain the same 2 parties? No. And even in Nigeria, it has not remained the same 2 parties, which means there's some sort of motion in terms of which are the 2 parties in system. I think it's really a lack of knowledge of how democratic systems operate that people think in Nigeria we have too many parties, we should reduce the number. I do feel that when I look at Mali, when I look at Benin Republic, they have 200 to 300 parties each. We still have in this country today only 18 political parties, which for our country cannot be considered too large. Of course, I just read in the papers today that there are about 100 new political associations that have applied for registration. So we may end up with more parties. My position on parties is this. When you have many parties on the ballot, it clogs the ballot, and voters often can't find which is their party because the ballot is too big there are too many symbols, they get confused. What most democratic countries do is that they place conditions for you to be on the ballot. You can, for instance, be on the ballot if you can get 500 Nigerians to sign a support letter for you. This means we wouldn't have the situation we have in this country where somebody has contested for president and in the presidential election is able to get 230 votes. That has happened in this country. Somebody who can only get 230 votes in the entire Nigeria shouldn't be on the ballot in the first place. I think we should introduce a measure to place conditionalities of widespread support before you can get on the ballot. Once you do that, you sanitize the ballot and have much fewer candidates on the ballot.
Technology, you alluded to the amendments that were done but which have not been assented to and need to be synthesized at the level of the National Assembly. And I referred to acrimony as part of that process. The most acrimonious part of the process was the issue of technology, bringing in electronic voting and transmission of results. Some of the people I've spoken to have had two views, essentially. One is that we're making too much of this, and that if the basic problem is not tackled, even the issue of, or the introduction of electronic voting and transmission of results may still give us the kind of outcomes that we currently have where it is possible to manipulate. So what do you make of that? First of all, there was a lot of acrimony. In your view, was that necessary? And if so, what was the end game?
I think part of the problem around the acrimony was a lack of understanding of what INEC had proposed in the bill, which is that they want electronic transmission of results. The National Assembly invited the NCC, and the position of the NCC is that we don't have sufficient coverage. But electronic transmission has already been practiced by INEC. It has field experience, and the figures the NCC gave were simply false figures. And therefore, for whatever reason, they want to stop the process. So Senate supported them, the House disregarded their position. I don't want to anticipate the results. They have told us in 2 or 3 weeks the committee will finish its work and they will give us the results of what is finally agreed on. But I do think the proposal for electronic transmission of results is very important. We know that the black hole in electoral fraud is collation of results. People vote in their polling unit, it's counted in the presence of everybody, it's announced, it's pasted. So everybody knows at their polling unit what's the result. When it goes to collation centers, then the magic begins to happen. If you succeed in directly transmitting results from the polling units to INEC headquarters, you bypass that possibility of manipulation. So it's very, very important in terms of protecting the integrity of our elections. On electronic voting, we have not yet arrived there. I think INEC has been investigating the possibilities. There are challenges, there are fears. One fear is, what if the system gets hacked? And that has happened in some countries. So people should genuinely be afraid. Are there technological systems to make sure hacking doesn't happen? Yes, there are technologies that have emerged today that can enable you to do that. And I think what INEC is doing is trying to see for future elections, maybe not for the coming one, how we can harness those new technologies, especially blockchain technology that can block any possibility of rigging. The fact of the matter is that in the coming decades, all democratic countries will move to electronic voting. our voting system is too complex, the logistics is too expensive, and electronic voting will simplify your voting system. Let me say there are two countries in the world that have leadership in electronic voting, Brazil and India. Both countries have been doing it for the past 30 years. Their systems have never been hacked. They've never had a problem. Currently, for the first time in the recent democratic history of Brazil, the sitting president is suddenly afraid that he will not win democratically. Over the past 2 months, he's been screaming and shouting, down with electronic voting machines. But that's an indication that quality lies on the side of electronic voting.
That would then bring me to the electoral management itself, because so far we've talked about the laws, the process, the voters, those being voted for, now the people who put together all of this. In our case, this is INEC. It has undergone several mutations in the history of the country under different names. But one thing had remained constant, which is the need for it to be independent. In reality, that is a contentious matter. But how, I mean, given the fact that you have observed elections in other places, many other places, how important is it for the electoral body to be independent? And how is it that ours is the way it is and the others are the way they are? Are there lessons to take from there that we can apply in our own case?
I think, first of all, our electoral management body has a significant level of independence. They are able to get their funds directly without going through lobbying processes or controlled by the executive. They are appointed by, proposed rather, by the president and approved by Senate. And Senate can reject candidates it feels may compromise the system. And as you are aware, that has happened in our system. When you compare our system with the others, our system is not that bad, frankly. Take two systems that are common in the West Africa region. One is to have what they call the All-Party Electoral Commission. So you have a commission where all the major parties have representatives who run the commission. The idea is they will
Check each other.
Yeah. We have studied some of those countries, and we find it's not very functional because they spend a lot of time fighting each other rather than planning and conducting the election. The other system you have in some of our countries, especially in West Africa, is to have essentially the Ministry of Interior running the elections, but having an electoral commission that doesn't conduct the election, but is a watchdog over what the ministry does. And that has also been proven to be very problematic, because that's the system we left in Nigeria, as you are aware. In the past, in the First Republic, the Ministry of Internal Affairs ran elections, and they could always tinker with things in favor of the sitting government. So when you do your comparative analysis, our system is not that bad. It can certainly be improved considerably. In the 2008 Electoral Reform Committee, the UWES committee as usually called, we gave very concrete proposals to improve the independence and autonomy of INEC. We should still campaign for those proposals to be accepted so that from day to day we continue to improve and stabilize the independence of the electoral body.
In that, when you mentioned that, I guess part of what it brings to mind is something else that has now cropped up to be a sort of challenge to everything we've spoken about now. Security. I mean, if we can't ensure that people get to the polling centers alive, cast their votes and get back home alive, many will not take the chance. And we have found that out in some of the elections that have been conducted more recently since our security challenges blossomed. What do you make of how important that is, especially against the backdrop that the government in authority at the moment says it is tackling that, but the matter has been politicized?
I don't think there is any politicization of the matter. The level of insecurity in Nigeria today is unprecedented. People can't do their normal chores in life. People are afraid to travel. People are afraid to go to the farms because they could be attacked on their farms. The roads have become something else. And I think every Nigerian is very aware at how the level of insecurity in the country has grown dramatically. And it will definitely impact on elections if something is not done about it. I think it's a question bigger and larger than elections. If this rainy season in many parts of this country, people are afraid to go to their farms, it will affect the harvest, it will affect food security. So it's something much larger than elections, and I do feel there has been failure on the part of the government to adequately address the insecurity in the country. They need to sit up, they need to do better.
There's a spill-on effect that some have said have come from our neighbors, and now moving into the realm of, shall we say, international affairs. Niger, Cameroon, Benin Republic, and even other contiguous countries, you mentioned Mali and so on, that the seeming instability in those places, Chad, that the seeming instability in those countries has had a profound impact on what we are now witnessing as our own security problems. And that Nigeria, being the big country within the region, should have stepped in before now to stabilize those countries, knowing fully well that whatever was wrong there would eventually have come here. Is that correct? And if so, what could we have done as a country?
Difficult question. Frankly, Nigeria used to step up and checkmate rising insecurity. We did that brilliantly in Sierra Leone. We did it in Liberia. It was really Mali 2012 that the first major failure of Nigeria happened. You remember when the jihadists started marching on Bamako, the country called on the neighbors, help. And the neighbors were discussing. Nigeria itself needed a week to send 500 troops to Mali. Chad immediately sent 2,000 troops. It was France that really intervened. And what that showed up was that the Nigerian armed forces were so stretched in handling our own internal issues that they had lost the capacity to be a major stabilizing factor in the West African zone. So I think it wasn't even a decision to help them or not to help them. It was much more simple. Could we do it? Do we have the extra troops to send out when we are so stretched internally? You know, I got quite frightened 3 months ago when former head of state, General Abdusalam Abubakar, said we had 6 million small arms and light weapons in the hands of civilians in this country, and they are using it. 6 million armed civilians in Nigeria using those arms. How many people do we have in our armed and security forces? We don't have as many. And that's why I'm saying, if you allow insecurity to grow and deepen, you will lose the capacity to handle the situation. And that's why we really must make a very serious effort at this time to address this rising insecurity in the country.
I will take you back to what I started with when I mentioned what the president said at the UN General Assembly this time, and that was the issue of democracy and West Africa. And that's still talking diplomacy and international affairs. In the case of Chad, the long-standing ruler there died after winning an election. His son, his eldest son, has taken his place in an interim capacity, we're told. In Niger Republic, there was an election. The ruling party won, but there were other forces that said they wouldn't accept. In Cameroon, there's a long-running insurgency. Some of the refugees are, in fact, in Nigeria, between Anglo and Francophone parts of Cameroon. In Benin Republic, President Talon has had his own battles with opposition forces in that country, including the former leader, Matthew Kirikou. I mention all this because these are complicated situations that have fed the instability in those areas and which has tended to spill over into Nigeria. So I go back to the question I asked, what do you think we can do in each one of those cases? Because we seem to have ignored those happenings as a country, and we're just focused internally.
I completely agree that we need to see what we can do, and in particular, that we remain on the side of democracy. Alpha Conde had just suffered a coup. The previous Salah, when he was preparing for his third-term constitutional change agenda, where did he go? He came to Nigeria, went to Daura to do Salah with President Buhari. He was given a chieftaincy title in Daura, and that strengthened him, and he went, forcibly changed the constitution, gave himself a third term, and look at where we are. Nigeria should have told him off that we are not going to support changing the constitution. For heaven's sake, this man is, I think, 75 years, if I remember correctly.
Actually, he's over 80.
Over 80. Why do you want a third term? You don't even have the energy to exercise power. Nigeria didn't do the right thing. They gave him a chieftaincy. He was happy. He smiled. He went and said, Big Brother Nigeria is supporting me to the citizens of Guinea. So part of what we need to do is, and I'm glad President Buhari made this point at the UN, that we do have a process of democratic regression occurring in Africa, and particularly in West Africa, that all of our countries must come out strongly on the side of democracy and dissociate and contest those leaders in West Africa that are trying to pull the hands of the clock backwards. That is necessary for the survival of democracy in West Africa, but also for its survival in our own country.
But then we have a problem with that, and that was what I was waiting for you to say before I said this. ECOWAS, the AU, and other such bodies have a policy of non-interference in other countries' domestic or sovereign affairs. But we've seen them break that. They broke that in the case of the Gambia with former President Yahya Jammeh. They broke that in the case of Mali, insisting that they should hand over, although the Malian authorities complied somewhat, but not completely. In the case of Guinea, that was a problem. And probably in the case of Cote d'Ivoire, where its own president too has just gotten himself a third term, this is the situation. They have not been able to dislodge Faou Nasingbe in Togo as a result of this kind of non-interference policy. So it seems as if there's a paradox here.
No, there's no paradox. The principle of non-interference has been set aside by West Africa. the Supplementary Protocol on Democracy and Good Governance makes all countries in West Africa stick with constitutional principles under whatever condition. That was why when in 2005, Iadema died and his son took over, you remember, General Obasanjo, and the president of Niger, who was then the chairperson
Of ECOWAS.
of ECOWAS, went to the country and said, no, you can't take over. And they made him step down. So they interfered in the politics of Togo. And the president of the Senate took over. Well, finally the son won anyway in the elections and came back. Now, 5 years later in 2010, Tanja, who led the delegation to Lomé, turned around and said he wanted a third term and said he wasn't going to have elections, he's giving himself more years. And Nigeria told Tanja, no, you can't do that. You led the delegation to Lomé and now you are guilty of the same thing. For the first time in its history, ECOWAS carried out a resolution saying they no longer recognize Tanja as the president of Niger because his term is over. So ECOWAS has moved forward. They are not always very consistent, I will agree with you, but in terms of principles, they have given themselves the ability to intervene in the internal affairs of countries who are trying to kick out democracy from their doors.
I'll bring you back home for my final question. And it relates, of course, to the democracy, the elections, and so on. Do you have fears towards 2023? Do you have fears? A lot of people say because of the various currents that are going on, there's the battle over zoning, which region should produce the president. There's the issue of the security, which we've touched on. There is the issue of economics, the level of poverty, the difficulty for so many people to survive and all of that. And that in between all that, we still have to comply with democratic processes and conduct elections for new leaders come 2023. Do you have fears? What are those fears and how best do you think we can overcome them?
In the 2 years preceding every election in this country, starting from the 1959 elections, there has been fears that the tension within the political class, the ethno-religious, ethno-regional clashes could compromise the elections. So it means we are in a normal phase. This is what happens. People are positioning themselves. People are preparing the grounds for a very tough and difficult contest. And it's normal they raise the stakes. It is important that they don't raise the stakes too high so that we are plunged into a calamity. But I believe that given what has been happening in the past, they will calm down things and the elections would happen without major hitches.
What should we be looking out for?
I think we should really be looking at nominations. Members of political parties have to intervene within their political parties to make sure godfathers don't just impose anybody they like as candidates of the parties. And when that happens, people should boycott those parties and look for parties who respect the views of the members of the parties. I think people have been too calm. They just look at their party bosses do what they want, and they either hiss in anger or walk away. And I'm saying, no, don't hiss in anger, don't walk away. Stay there, fight for who you think the best candidates are. And Nigerians do know who their best candidates are, but the way the primaries are conducted, often the best candidates never emerge. I think that's really the strategic change we need to make as a people. how can we impact more directly as ordinary citizens on the choices that are made for candidates within political parties.
How about the youth? Because they are the ones who I was referring to earlier when I talked about apathy. They seem to be completely interested. They probably are more interested in reality TV shows. They're more interested in the banks that are online and all of that. When you mention elections, they simply turn off.
Yeah, a lot of our youth have given up on elections without really understanding its importance. It is important for the youth to realize two things. Elections are important because those who exercise power determine the conditions under which you live. So everybody should prioritize elections. The second thing is that the youth are upset that we have old people contesting for candidates. The last election, the two leading candidates, we know their ages. And this is a country of a very young, with a very young population. The reality of politics, I've been studying politics for 50 years now, is that nobody will give you power if you don't fight for it. And the youth should realize they have a demographic majority in this country. If they engage in politics, they can choose their own candidates and they can vote for them. And they can get rid of all these old people, my generation and those older than me, who are today in power in this country. Seize this opportunity, throw out the elderly, take power for themselves, and change Nigeria for the better. That's my message to the youth.
I hope they're listening. Thank you very much, Professor Ibrahim, for your time today.
It's a pleasure.
That's Newsnight. Thanks for watching. I am Ladi Akeredoluale. We do so much love to hear from you about this conversation and much more. Our social media handles are on your screen. You can also listen to this and previous episodes of the program by visiting our website, channelstv.com/podcast. Goodbye.